Okay, well, welcome everyone during this lecture. Especially welcome to everyone who is attending it, but of course also especially I would like to thank Ulysses and his colleague who helped me to prepare this webinar. My name is Diana Dolmans and I'm a staff member at the Maastricht University. I am involved in, no sound, Diana. I see that there is a message from Ulysses about my sound. So Ulysses, can you hear me? Please could you indicate in the chat box if you can hear me well? Ulysses, can you hear me? Okay, so the sound is okay. So thank you then. Well, then again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is participating in this lecture. I will start with telling you something about my research, which is basically on problem-based learning, and especially something about my final review, one of my latest papers dealing with the question if problem-based learning does enhance deep learning. Since it will be difficult to give a talk and concentrate on my slides and in the meantime read the live chat, it's okay if you enter your questions in the live chat, but I will probably answer them at the end. So let me first explain a little about what this presentation will be about. So I will go to the next slide. What I would like to talk about this afternoon is about challenges facing traditional education, something why I think that PBL does offer a solution to these challenges faced within traditional education. I will explain something about current instructional design principles, current learning principles, and then I will show you something about research dealing with PBL enhancing deep learning, and I will stop with some take-home messages, and of course there will be some time for answering questions at the end. So first of all, when we take a look at education today, I think that nowadays many people who try to develop educational programs, they both want to educate students to become experts, subject matter experts in their field, but also we want to prepare our students to acquire 21st century skills, such as communication skills, collaboration skills, critical thinking skills, and creativity skills. And the question is, given these both aims, how can we adequately prepare our students to acquire both domain and generic competencies? When we take a look at traditional education, we often see that, within these programs, knowledge is taught discipline by discipline or piece by piece. And within these traditional programs, which are mainly lecture-based often, there is a strong focus on knowledge transmission. So typically what we do within these traditional courses is we teach a principle, we demonstrate to the student during the lecture how to apply it, and thereafter we ask the learner to apply it. So knowledge, skills, and attitudes are more or less trained separately in different strands. We have for the lectures, we typically transfer knowledge, we have a skills training program, and maybe we have some activities dealing with attitudes. But often these three are not well related with each other. And as a consequence, it's difficult for students to integrate knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And it's very difficult for students to apply what they have learned in real practice or new situations. And this latter is called transfer to practice. So often when we teach something, students will be able to apply it immediately during or after the course, but when we give a new problem, it will be very difficult for them to transfer the knowledge and skills to a new problem. So transfer to practice is limited. We think that problem-based learning might offer a solution to these problems that are faced with traditional lecture-based teaching. And why? Well, that's what I would like to explain in my lecture. But before I do so, first let me explain what I see as problem-based learning. So problem-based learning has a few main elements. And the first one is that learning takes place in small groups. The second is that learning is initiated by professionally relevant problems. So we always start from a problem that is relevant for the student's future profession. On top of that, we have a tutor who facilitates the group learning, and new information is acquired through self-study. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when I'm talking about PBL, that these are the main principles. Because nowadays, we also have all kinds of hybrid programs. Some people might call a program a PBL program, whereas it does not fit with these main elements. So what I'm talking about is PBL, which can be characterized by these elements. So then the question is, does PBL indeed educate students to become experts and lifelong learners? But there is a plea, and we think that this is what PBL is doing. But the question is, what is the evidence so far? Well, here I have two quotes from students' opinions about PBL. And one says, PBL is really interesting in that it allows you to explore the concept thoroughly. You discuss various things and get people to argue with you. To explore different views is really enriching. Another student, which we interviewed about PBL, said, I really noticed that other people are critical about other issues than I was critical about, and other people made different linkages than I did. So I think that these quotes illustrate what actually we are trying to achieve within problem-based learning. But these are, of course, students' opinions. And so my first statement is, PBL graduates report superior general competencies, collaboration skills, and communication skills. And, it will not be easy, I think, to answer this question, but just to activate you as participants during my lecture, I would ask you to think about this statement. Do you agree with the statement? Do you think that the evidence does indeed demonstrate that PBL graduates report superior general skills, or do you think that studies on PBL do not demonstrate these findings? Just to activate you. So what's your opinion about it? And it's not possible now to communicate with you, but otherwise I could ask you some questions. But think about it. Well, so what do we know from the evidence so far? Well, first of all, here on my slide, I present some overall findings about problem-based learning. Many studies have been done on PBL, and what we know from these studies is that students are really very satisfied with problem-based learning. They really enjoy being in a program. That sounds interesting, It's important, I think, because if students would not be satisfied, it would be even more difficult to gain from your teaching and the education. So it's important, but it's not really hard evidence. But what also many studies have demonstrated is that indeed, as someone is writing, yes, the majority of the students indeed report, these are self-reports, that they acquire general competencies. And this is really, I think, good news. So what PBL is really doing well is that we teach them and that they acquire competencies like collaboration. These are self-reported gains, but also when you ask employers, a few years ago, in the Netherlands, some medical schools were using PBL, others not. And employers could see the differences. They also said, well, we feel that these PBL students are better able to communicate and better able to collaborate with others. But now I come to the second part of my lecture, which is that problem-based learning also matches current instructional design principles and matches well with current learning principles. And I'll explain in my next slides what I mean with these principles. Well, when we take a look at nowadays at people who are doing research in instructional design, so those are people who think about, how should we optimally design a learning environment, they have certain principles that are very common. And one of them is that all these models say, well, if you really want to teach students to gain expert knowledge and generic competencies, you should focus on professionally relevant problems. And that's, I think, what PBL does. Another recommendation guideline from these instructional designers is, well, whenever you design a course, you should offer a variety of problems ordered from simple to complex. And I think that's also what we do within PBL. And then a third one is, when students work on these problems, it's important that we offer them support to the learner. And this can be support in various ways. As a teacher, you should scaffold, you should offer support, but also not too much support to make the student fully independent. So as teachers, we should offer support, but on the other hand, also stimulate students to self-direct their learning. So I think when you take a look at PBL, we offer problems, and these problems are aimed at integrating knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So we start with a PBL problem, give a skills training related to it, and maybe also focus on attitudes related to the specific problem under discussion. Within the small tutorial groups, we stimulate students to apply what they learned to varied problems. We could, for example, say, okay, now you've studied this problem and you report it back, but assume it would be a little different. Assume the patient would be a little younger or older or any other situation that you use. And we stimulate them to apply the knowledge. And we support the learner by offering them a tutor and resources for self-study. Then something about current learning principles. So what do we know about human learning so far? And these are 4 principles that are generally well known within the field. So these are constructive learning, self-directed learning, contextual learning, and collaborative learning. And I'll explain them in the next slides. So constructive learning basically says that learning is promoted when learners activate their relevant prior knowledge and when they have to elaborate or generate new relationships between concepts. And in PBL, for example, we stimulate students to explain in their own words, which is meant to help them to generate new meaningful relations. Then another important learning principle is called self-directed learning, and which says that learning is promoted when learners play an active role in planning, monitoring, and evaluating their learning. So we should stimulate students to take the lead in their own learning. We should, of course, support them, but also stimulate them to become self-directed learners, which is quite a kind of tension, It's always, difficult to find the optimal balance between providing support and making the students self-directed. A third principle is contextual learning. So learning is promoted when learners engage in solving or discussing meaningful problems, when we stimulate them to articulate the underlying principles or mechanisms within a specific problem, and when we stimulate them to apply new acquired knowledge to varied problems. And then the fourth principle is about collaborative learning. So learning is promoted when learners deeply interact with each other about complex problems. And when we fit this to PBL, I think it fits quite well with problem-based learning, because within the small tutorial, when students have their first discussion, we ask them to think aloud What do you already know about the problem? We also ask them to elaborate and think next, and what could be another idea about this, and to make relations between what is said between the different students. We stimulate students in problem-based learning to generate issues for self-study, to search for sources themselves, although we also give some help. And, making them become aware of what they don't know and what they still need to study, resulting in these generation of issues for self-study, is, I think, a good way to stimulate students to self-direct their learning. And of course, contextual learning, that's quite obvious, as well as the collaborative one, since we ask students to deeply interact with each other in the group and to compare and contrast problems and to apply what they've learned to the PBL problem that they were discussing. But, this sounds very nice from a kind of theoretical perspective, but we all face challenges with problem-based learning in day-to-day practice. And as I told you at the start, I'm a staff member at Maastricht University. We have here at Maastricht University different faculties who all apply problem-based learning for over 40 years. And I'm working at the Faculty of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences, as you can see on my slides. But I have to be honest, we also face challenges with problem-based learning in our day-to-day practice. And also, when I am a tutor, I also face these challenges when, working with the students. Well, what are these challenges? I think that you will recognize many of them in my next slide. Well, we often see that students prepare poorly before they go to the meeting, and especially when there is a post-discussion taking place. Some students really have a poor preparation, due to which they find it difficult, for example, to explain what they've learned during self-study in their own words. What I also noticed, and I think you will recognize this as well, is limited brainstorming. So students read the problem, start with a brainstorm, just mention some topics, and when I ask them as a tutor, well, explain a little more, what do you mean by this? They often feel like, is this all necessary? Should we do it in this way? They want to do it very quickly. So there is, on occasions, a superficial discussion at the start, but also, of course, I have seen superficial post-discussions in which students, for example, read aloud their notes, read aloud from their notebooks, instead of really have a deep discussion in which they link what they tell with what other students are explaining in their own words, in which they discuss cognitive disagreements. Okay, you read this, and this book says this, but what I read was this. How does this fit? Where does it not fit? How can we explain this? And that's something that we not always see. And of course, also unequal participation by students. Some students dominate the discussion, which is very difficult for the tutor. So how to handle the dominant students. But we also have some students who are very silent, which on occasions might not be a problem if they on occasions contribute something that is often very good. But it's really a challenge to make all students participate in the discussion. And all these problems, also relate back to surface learning by students. So they prepare at home during self-study or in the library here, but they really study at a very surface level. They have heard some concepts, but are not really able to agree or to explain in their own words what they have been studying. And that's called a lack of deep learning. So what is actually deep learning? So basically, PBL is aimed at stimulating students to engage in deep learning. But in practice, we face problems with this. But let me first explain what is meant with deep learning. Martin and Salio and Trickwell and Biggs, they make a distinction between deep and surface learning approaches. And the surface approach is mainly aimed at reproducing content, rote learning, or memorization. We all recognize this, students have an exam, little time, so quickly just scan, memorize, go to the test, and that's it. Whereas a deep approach to learning is aimed at really understanding the content, relating what you learn to prior knowledge, making comparison, making deep analysis, and understanding the underlying principles. So there is really a distinction between surface and deep learning. And in the meantime, I took a look at the chat box, and someone said, indeed, I presented some challenges that we all face with these students using a surface approach or a surface discussion, and how to overcome this problem. Well, I will give a few solutions to overcome this problem in the end. But I first would like to explain what is meant with surface and deep learning. Okay? So deep learning is a student's intention to understand content, relate and structure ideas, to look for underlying principles, weighing relevant evidence, and critically evaluating knowledge. I have to make one more warning, because for me, students' approaches to learning is not the same as learning style, because a learning style is very personal and very stable. What I'm talking about is about students' approaches to learning, and they are perceived to be changeable. And now that's very important, they can be influenced by or interact with characteristics of the learning environments. So this means that when we as teachers design PBL courses in such a way that we can stimulate students to become deep learners, and so that the learning environment can interact with the students' approaches. And I'll explain that a little further on. But first of all, is there any evidence that PBL does enhance deep learning? Problem-based learning has been investigated in many, many studies all over the world, which I think is amazing. And there are even some people who argue, can we still do some research on PBL? Because there has been so much published, but I think, yes, there are still many questions that can be answered. But first of all, I did a review with some colleagues to see what the studies on PBL and deep learning, what we could learn from these studies. And here comes my second statement. Oh no, wait, sorry. And this review was a review of the literature on PBL and deep learning. And I had two research questions. The first one is, what are the effects of problem-based learning on students' deep and surface approaches to learning? And do these effects differ across a single course PBL implementation versus a curriculum-wide PBL implementation? And here comes the statement. What do you think? Do you agree with the following statement, yes or no? Will most studies that I reviewed demonstrate an increase in deep learning or not? So maybe some could write yes or no in the chat box, or think about it yourself. So thus, I reviewed, I think it were about 22 studies who were included in this review. So this number of studies was limited. Someone is saying, yes, I think that most studies demonstrate a positive effect of PBL on deep learning. Anyway, think about it. I show you what I found in this review. Well, indeed, I see another yes in the chat box. And not always. Yeah, Ulysses, yes, that's also think a good tip. But that was not one of the answer options. I had yes or no, so you had to choose. But anyway, yes. Well, what could we conclude from these studies? First of all, most studies show a small positive effect of PBL on deep learning. And most studies that show no effect on surface learning. But Indeed, as Ulysses said, it was not very clear because we also had some studies with negative effects or no effects at all on deep learning. But I go to that in a minute. First of all, the differences, what we also found was that the differences can partly be explained by the environment. And the studies seem to demonstrate that curriculum-wide implementation has a more positive impact as compared to a single course PBL implementation on deep learning. Well, what the effects are that we think that PBL does enhance deep learning is, of course, related to what I told you earlier. So the mechanisms within PBL that enhance deep learning are constructive and collaborative learning, due to which students interact, analyze, compare, contrast, or predict the problems. But, and here comes what Ulysses says, findings are often inconsistent. So we also saw studies in which students really did, for example, in the beginning, take a deep approach, but later years, they took a less deep approach. And one of the things is that, especially when you take a look at these studies, that many of these studies reported, for example, that a high perceived workload among the students also had a negative effect on deep learning. And you can imagine, it's very logic, when you have to study hard, when time is too limited, when we as teachers, often too enthusiastic, put too many materials in a course, students feel overwhelmed and, they start just reading everything at a very superficial level. Another thing that plays an important role is, of course, the assessment format. Because if we want students to really engage deeply, then we should also offer assessment formats in which they can really demonstrate that they did a good job in understanding the materials at a deep level. And not only ask them to fill out some superficial MCQs dealing with some facts within the literature and not really dealing with deeper issues. It's not to say that it's not good to use MCQs, multiple choice questions, but the assessment should be well aligned with the intentions of deep learning. And what I call this, and what also is mentioned in the literature by Biggs, is that there is often a lack of constructive alignment in our teaching courses. But before I switch to the next slide, I would like to say something about deep and surface learning. Deep learning is what we actually want students to do. But this does not say that you should never take a surface approach. So it's not like that surface is always poor or that you never need to, just cram things. Of course, you also need to have some basic knowledge which needs some cramming or whatever. But I think the focus is mainly on deep learning. So deep learning is crucial here. What do I mean with constructive alignment? Let's go to the next slide. Well, constructive alignment is basically, and this is more about the solutions, how to overcome the challenges within PBL. It's about aligning the learning environment with the intended learning outcomes, which are, from my perspective, deep learning. And if we want to make sure that students really adopt a deep approach to learning, then we as educators should ensure that all elements of the learning environments drive students towards deep learning. So constructive alignment is about optimizing the environment to encourage learners to engage in deep learning. But how to optimize PBL, the environment? Well, this is, I think, for me, a key slide. So when we're talking about problem-based learning and all the principles that I taught you about, for a PBL course, the PBL problem should be the core element of the course. So whenever we design a course, the PBL problem, that should be the core element which drives student self-study activities. And the skills training, they should be designed in such a way that they fit well with the PBL problem, that they add to it. The lectures, they should also add to the PBL problem, and as well as the assessment should be well aligned with the PBL problems. But if, for example, students might feel, well, when I take a look at the assessment, it's mainly about what is being taught in the lectures and not what's being covered in the discussions during the PBL problems, then there is a problem. And the problem is there is no alignment, constructive alignment, due to which students might choose to not take a deep approach to learning. So alignment is crucial. And I think, when you take a look at PBL, we spend a lot of time in training our tutors to be good facilitators of the PBL sessions. That's important. But when we design PBL problems that have a high quality, that's, I think, even more crucial. And often, also within my institution, we forget to train teachers how to design high quality PBL problems. Whereas, if you have a high quality PBL problem, the group will more or less, and the problem, do the work on its own. And it will be a little easier for you as a tutor to guide this group. So what do I mean when I talk about a high quality PBL problem? Well, it should be related to the student's future profession. It should fit with students' prior knowledge. The problem should be ordered from simple to complex. And these problems should be well aligned with all other course activities like lectures, like skills training, and so on. And the problem should be the core. And we should also use a varied set of PBL problems. So, a few years ago at Maastricht, we mainly used paper problems. But nowadays, we also have computer problems, we have simulated problems, and even within our third year medical curriculum, students start with a PBL problem on paper, discuss it in a small group, generate issues, study, for example, about a woman with a knee problem, and then, before they have the next tutorial, they first meet a real patient with a knee problem with 2 students. They take the anamnesis, do some research, talk with the patient, and then after that come back to the tutorial group and discuss about it. And one of my PhD students has done research on this PBL format in which we use real practice problems. And the time is limited, so I will not present these data, but it was really very motivating for students. And we also saw that students really felt that they could apply what they learned during a case. So my message here is we should spend more efforts as teachers on designing PBL problems, making varied problems, and real practice problems, bigger problems, whatever. So to keep students really motivated and to strengthen and to enhance the transfer of learning to real practice. So I come to the end of my presentation and I will summarize before we have some time for questions. So, well, is there any evidence that PBL does enhance deep learning? That was my talk about. And, my message is, yes, in theory it does, but in practice, it's strongly dependent on the context. So, PBL, it's very difficult to say, is PBL always and ever effective? No, it depends on the way in which you implement it, and it's strongly dependent on the context. And that's why we always need further research, and also about these design principles. So how does it fit with my context? How does it fit with my students? How does it fit with my setting, my institution? So it's much more complicated. Education research is really complex. There are many, many different variables that interact with each other. And that's why we need much more research in this area. So the final slide with my take-home messages. PBL fits well with current instructional design principles and learning principles. PBL does seem to enhance deep learning, but let us be careful. Has little effect on surface learning, but the effects of PBL are strongly dependent on how all PBL elements are constructively well aligned. So thank you very much so far, and this is basically my lecture. So I think I'm now talking for about 40 minutes with 40 slides. So that's nice. So we then have approximately 15-20 minutes for questions. Am I right, Ulysses? Can we start with the questions? And Ulysses cannot answer me, but just answer in the chat box. So may I invite people who are attending to ask a question? Okay, I will read aloud. Yeah, you can all read it, but just I need time to read it. Would you say that the findings you have for adult learning apply also for learning by younger students? Aha, thank you for this great question, Pedro. Well, I think, Pedro, that many of these principles fit to both adult learners and younger students. But of course, you always have to do research and apply PBL and fit it to the specific context. So when these students are younger, you perhaps need a little more support, but still the principles apply. But my advice would be, you have to find a way how PBL could fit with this situation. And the younger students also should be stimulated to, be stimulated towards making use of problems that are highly relevant or have any meaning for them. When I nowadays take a look at, especially, for example, within the Netherlands, in the secondary education, we see that it is in transition, but many of these secondary school classes are still lecturing. Students have to learn words and that's it. But I think that many of these principles apply. We did some research within secondary schools to translate this, but you always have to translate it and to fit it to the specific context. Okay, now I have to take a look at the questions. So I'm sorry if I pronounce some names wrong, but Alexander, I agree with the problem crafting issue. I wonder what its effects is in comparison with the effect of, cannot read it fully, but I think that I understand what you mean, the effects of the other elements. Well, Hank Schmidt, I think many of you will know him because he was my promoter, but he has written a lot about problem-based learning. And we also did some research together. But for example, we did some studies, and also Hank Schmidt, in which he looked at the impact of the different variables. The tutor, prior knowledge, quality of the PBL problems, the assessment, the tutorial group. And what we learned from these studies is that the quality of the PBL problems has the highest effect. So, I'm not saying that we should not spend time on training tutors, but we should not forget to also train teachers how to design PBL problems. In your lecture, so I'm now Ulysses or Valeria. In your lecture, thinking that teachers sometimes overwhelm students is something to think about, and this may block deep learning and the PBL role on that. Yeah, and indeed, when we teachers on occasions overwhelm students, and to be honest, I was a tutor a few weeks ago with these first year students, and they were still struggling with how to take the lead within the group, how to activate some students. And then you often tend to make mistakes as a tutor to intervene too much. So it's really a difficult challenge. You want to help them, not too much. It's working very hard. And I think, as tutors, we often receive a training how to deal with this when we start with our career at a PBL institution, and thereafter we have to find our own way. But I think what is crucial here is that we as tutors also meet with each other on a regular basis and share our experiences. How do you do that? What do you do when students are sitting behind their screens and read aloud? Do you dare to say, please close the laptop and have a deeper discussion and explain? So it's a challenge. And I think it's also a paradox. So on the one hand, we want students to become self-directed learners. On the other hand, they should, achieve the objectives that we have in mind, and they should do what we want them to do, and we should offer them support. If we give too much, it's really a big challenge. And that's why I think we as tutors need training and also need research in this area. Alejandra, since you mentioned PBL is strongly dependent on the context, do you suggest to conduct a survey prior to launch PBL on a particular course to understand better the context? Thank you, Alejandra. I like this question. I'm not sure if we should just ask students prior to their experiences to PBL what they would prefer. Not sure about this, because they actually don't know maybe what PBL is if it's fully new to them. But what I see nowadays, what is being done more and more is so-called participatory designs, research designs, or action research, or whatever you call it, design-based research. So what we typically do, and the studies I'm involved in now do this, is that we as researchers, educational designers, teachers, students, sit together, develop a course. As educationalists, we help them with the theory. As teachers, they think how to translate this. We talk a lot with each other. We make a kind of blueprint. We make a course. We ask input from students. And after the course is run, we observe during the course when students are working together. But also after the course, we interview students, we interview teachers, we might send them a questionnaire, ask them about how motivating this was. So I think, it's not only about surveys, but it's more about, co-creation, a kind of co-design, and doing research together, design-based research. And that's something that we really need more. And then we can also, start from a theory, but also take a look in practice. How does this work here? And what could we learn from your situation? Let me see, another question. Ulysses gives me a message. I think it's now another 10 minutes to go, but if I should stop, Ulysses should say stop, Diana, okay? Or tell me how many minutes, but I think 5 or 10 minutes still to go. Let me see. There are several questions here. I'm just reading and see someone else. I like this one too. Paulo says, not only construct high-quality PBL problems on a single discipline, but build a whole curriculum towards competency development. Yes, thank you very much for this excellent comment. I'm talking here about PBL problems, but a PBL problem is part of a course is part of a bigger curriculum. And the principles that I was presenting hold to this whole idea. So yes, I agree. And also the remark is, and that's also something we need to think of, we have these curriculum committees who design an overall blueprint of a curriculum. And what I also like about this command is not on one single discipline. I think, yes, in reality, we as professionals are not confronted with problems focusing on one discipline, but indeed covering multiple disciplines. And for me, a good PBL problem, but also a course, unites different disciplines, starts from a real problem in practice that the professional will be faced with. And in order to be able to deal with it, he should learn a lot about the problem from different angles and different disciplines. So thank you for that wonderful remark. Okay, yeah. So I see 5 p.m. we will stop in Maastricht, and that's indeed another 9 minutes. Someone asked about sharing the list of references. Well, that's something that I could see with Ulysses what we could do about it. Now I go to the chat box. Yeah, see what else has been asked. Another one, Giovanni. Some teachers, he writes, complain of high workload to do PBL. Isn't there technologies to improve the productivity in PBL operational implementation? Again, interesting and a relevant question. I did not say anything about technologies, but sure, this does play a role. And some of my colleagues who will also present their work at the conference in February, they really are working on this, and they really introduce very nice technologies. For example, a kind of VR glasses in which students can see, for example, how a professional is working in real practice, based on which they can have their discussion in a small group. And there are many really technologies available, and we definitely need some more research in this, to really stimulate the discussion. And we need to think about, how to integrate them in our curriculum, because it's not only about these technologies, but it's also about, in the end, student learning. And we should do research on how these technologies could enhance their learning, but on occasions might also hinder. But these technologies are really very crucial and available nowadays. And for me, I think the lesson that we learned in Maastricht is also we should not do the same for 4 years with the students. So have a paper case, have a discussion, have a pre-discussion, have a post-discussion, have a skills training, have a lecture. But we should really work on, having some variations for students to make it attractive to them, to increase the level of authenticity. So from paper simulated to real and all kinds of problems. And these technologies nowadays, they offer great advantages. They can really be beneficial, although we also should be careful. Okay, Paolo wrote, good guided instruction and prompts seem to be critical to making students aware of their metacognitive knowledge. Yes, Paolo, I agree. That's something that we're also working on, because, self-regulating their learning, students' learning, is not that easy. And also, there's little known about what students actually do during self-study. So now another colleague within my department, she's also focusing on this more from the metacognitive side, thinking about what kind of prompts we can give students to help them to set their goals, to evaluate. And I think, prompts can be helpful, but it's also very much about having a dialogue with the student. As teachers, making the students, him or herself, have a dialogue with him or herself, and enhancing dialogue among the students. But prompts and instructions can be very beneficial. does the development of metacognitive abilities related to self-regulation need to be scaffolded? Yeah, that's, I think, the same question more or less. Yes. And that's also not easy. So we're searching for ways how we could help them. Nowadays we see, for example, these kind of portfolios in which students are stimulated to report on their progress, to think about what they actually are doing, but also the tutor can play an important role in this as well. And there's much more research to be done in this area. I think that I answered workload. Paola says something like workload compared to traditional lectures. Yeah, that's something that's also interesting. Some people argue, well, we cannot introduce problem-based learning in our institution because that's too much workload. Yes, teachers experience quite some workload, but I think, we should also keep in mind that, often, especially teachers within traditional curricula, they always think, a student will only learn something when I talk to him, like I'm doing now. And we give them hours of lectures, which, is easy. You can handle 200 students. But given that they often schedule many hours, we also overload students. So I think it's much better to have less hours scheduled and making these more productive in terms of stimulating students to activate themselves. And that is what I think is crucial here. And teachers complain, but it's also, we do not receive more money than other medical schools who do not use PBL. Although I must say that nowadays within the Netherlands, for example, all medical schools use teaching methods that are very aimed at activating students. So we have no real traditional schools in the medical field. So it's changing. Anyway, I think, oops, hello, here are the questions, that it's time to say thank you to everyone. Probably I could not answer all your questions or not sufficiently because you could not give me some feedback, but I really would like to end this session with thanking all the people who are participating in this webinar. Thank you to Ulysses and thank you to Lucas, who made who really helped me very well with setting up this. And also thank you to my secretary, Nikki, who was also very helpful. So thank you very much, everyone. And, I wish you either a good day, if it's still morning, or a good afternoon, or a good sleep when it's still in the middle of the night. And, of course, I hope to see you all at the PAN-PBL conference in San Francisco in February. So thank you very much, everyone. And I just say bye-bye.